In the quiet heart of suburbia, a man walked among neighbors with a shovel, a smile, and secrets buried deep in the earth. This is the story of what they never saw coming, and the graves that still keep his truth. The air in western Maryland was crisp that spring morning, sunlight spilling over the slopes of the Appalachian foothills. At first glance, the valley outside Cumberland looked like the sort of postcard-perfect scene where nothing bad could possibly happen. But in the shadow of a green mountain, a fortress of brick, razor wire, and steel squatted like a sleeping beast, Western Correctional Institution. From the highway, you might mistake it for a sprawling factory complex, low buildings stretching nearly a mile. But this was no place of industry. It was a warehouse for human predators, designed to make sure those inside never slipped free. Inside its double rings of chain link and razor coil, under the watch of floodlit towers, some of the most dangerous men in Maryland lived out their days. One of them was Hadden Clark. If you only knew him from the outside, you might be caught off guard. He was tall, thin, and soft-spoken, with pale blue eyes that could seem almost shy. His bloodline traced back to the Mayflower. His family tree was dotted with military officers and social respectability. On paper, he was supposed to be the product of good breeding, an heir to generations of privilege. But there was nothing noble about what Hadden Clark had become. Behind the steel door of his cell, he often wasn't Hadden at all. Some days, he insisted he was Kristen Bluefin, a 37-year-old woman. Other times, he slipped into the persona of Nicole, Kristen's so-called evil daughter. In those altered states, he would claim it wasn't him. It was Kristen who strangled Laura Houghteling, and it was Nicole who butchered little Michele Dorr. He swore he never killed anyone. Not as Hadden. It was a neat trick for a man accused of murdering more than once, a man suspected of more bodies than anyone could prove. And it wasn't just murder. The whispers were darker. Cannibalism, mutilation, a taste for human flesh that Hadden reportedly compared to veal. His life inside the prison walls was as bizarre as the crimes outside them. He hoarded food until it rotted, hanging sausage links from dental floss like a pioneer curing meat for winter. He shaved his head and eyebrows, sang children's hymns in a falsetto that chilled the air, and played expert-level chess against anyone foolish enough to think they could beat him. And through the vent of his cell, he whispered to the man next door, an inmate who called himself Jesus. Jesus wasn't the Son of God, but he looked the part, shoulder-length hair, pointed beard, and the kind of calm that comes from decades behind bars. He'd been locked up since the mid-70s for a murder of his own, and now he was serving a different purpose. The FBI had asked him to be Hadden's confessor, his coaxer, the one who could get Clark to talk. And talk Hadden did, page after page in his cramped handwriting, sometimes illustrated with crude, blood-red drawings, chronicled what he'd done. Sometimes the blood on the page was literally his own. But with Hadden, truth and fiction were tangled like the razor wire outside. Was he exaggerating for notoriety, as so many serial killers did? Or was he still hiding the true scope of his crimes? That was the puzzle, the deadly uncertainty, that kept investigators circling back. What everyone agreed on was this: if Hadden Clark ever got out, he would kill again. Long before the prison walls closed in around him, Hadden Clark's life began in a setting that looked nothing like the background of a killer. The Clarks were old-stock, New England aristocracy with a pedigree stretching back nearly 4 centuries to the deck of the Mayflower. Their ancestors had fought in the American Revolution, worn officers' uniforms in the nation's earliest wars, and filled dinner tables with stories of honor and service. On the surface, this was a lineage you'd find in the pages of history books, not in the case files of homicide detectives. But in the Clark household, history and reality were two very different things. Hadden was born in 1952, the second son of Jeffrey and Allison Clark. By the time he came along, the cracks in his parents' marriage were already showing. Behind the respectability, the Cape Cod summers, the country club acquaintances, there was chaos. Alcohol flowed more freely than affection. Arguments could detonate without warning, and when they did, they left more than bruised feelings. Jeffrey Sr., a decorated Navy officer, carried the clipped formality of military life into his parenting, but not its discipline. He could be cruel without raising his voice, and sometimes without even speaking at all. Allison, Hadden's mother, could be just as cutting, her moods veering from smothering to scornful. The home was not a safe harbor. It was a place where a child learned early to hide what he felt. From the outside, though, none of this was visible. The Clarks still played their parts in the genteel theater of upper-class America. They sent their children to respectable schools, dressed them neatly for family photographs, and kept the more unsavory truths locked away behind closed doors. Hadden was a quiet boy, tall for his age and physically awkward, the kind of child other kids noticed, and not in a way that made life easier. He was teased for his shyness, for the strange, halting way he spoke when put on the spot. Even as a child, he seemed adrift, disconnected from the social current around him. But the isolation wasn't the only thing that set him apart. Animals, the small, trusting creatures that other children nurtured, didn't fare well around Hadden. Family pets disappeared. Neighbors whispered. The pattern was one criminologists would later recognize, the quiet rehearsal for darker acts to come. In those years, his older brother, Jeff Jr., was already finding his own trouble, running into brushes with the law, pushing against rules. The Clark household was a breeding ground for dysfunction, and it was producing more than one troubled son. By his teens, Hadden's world was narrowing. He learned to retreat into himself, into private fantasies where he could control the story. The family's wealth and standing meant that for a time, his oddities were dismissed as quirks. Teachers might mutter that he was different, but no one looked too closely. Not yet. No one, not his family, not his teachers, not even Hadden himself, could see the shape of what he was becoming. But already the conditions were set. The distance from his peers, the cold, chaotic home life, the small acts of cruelty that came without consequence. In the years ahead, those seeds would grow into something monstrous. And when they did, Hadden Clark wouldn't be the only predator in the family. By the time Hadden Clark reached adulthood, the Clark name still carried weight. But for him, it no longer offered much protection. His relationship with his family had grown increasingly strained. He was the odd one, the son who didn't quite fit the image of a respectable heir. Where his relatives moved with social ease, Hadden remained socially awkward, prone to uncomfortable silences or comments that didn't land the way he intended. In his early 20s, he sought structure in the same place his father once found it, the military. The U.S. Navy offered order, discipline, and purpose, or so it seemed. Hadden trained as a cook, a role that kept him below the deck spotlight. On the surface, it was an unremarkable assignment, but it didn't take long for the cracks to show. He was teased relentlessly by fellow sailors, mocked for his demeanor and what some saw as effeminate mannerisms. The military, for all its formality, could be a brutal place for an outsider. Hadden retreated further into himself, nursing grudges, memorizing slights. His time in uniform ended without distinction, and without the kind of transformation his family might have hoped for. Back in civilian life, he drifted. He took odd jobs, cooking, gardening, handyman work, but nothing that stuck. Employers found him unreliable or simply unsettling. There was a subtle discomfort about him, something that didn't always announce itself immediately but emerged with time. Neighbors and acquaintances began to notice peculiar habits. Hadden sometimes dressed in women's clothing, not as a joke, but as part of a private identity he seemed to slip into without warning. When confronted, he could be defensive, even combative, but just as often he would smile thinly and deflect the conversation. It was during these years that the first police reports began to appear. Nothing that tied him to violence, not yet, but enough to suggest a man who was skirting the edges of acceptable behavior. Petty thefts, trespassing, odd encounters that ended with someone calling the authorities. Each incident was a warning shot, but none of them set off the kind of alarm that might have stopped him. Beneath the surface, a darker world was taking shape. Hadden's private life was increasingly dominated by his inner fantasies. Some sexual, some violent, and some both. The boundaries between them blurred. He collected knives, practiced stalking behaviors, and took pleasure in hunting animals. It was as though he was rehearsing for something perfecting skills he might one day turn on human prey. Still, outwardly, he could pass as harmless. In the right setting, he was quiet, even polite. He could cook a fine meal, tend a garden with care, and carry on a conversation that gave no hint of what he was capable of. But the pressure was building, and sooner or later, the life he was living and the fantasies in his head were going to collide. When they did, it wouldn't just be a single act of violence. It would be the opening of a door he would never close again. The spring air in Silver Spring, Maryland, was cool and damp on May 31st, 1986, the kind of day when neighborhood kids ran in and out of backyards until dusk, their voices carrying over the sound of lawnmowers and birdsong. 6-year-old Michele Lee Dorr was one of those children. She was small for her age, with light hair, bright eyes, and a smile that seemed almost too big for her face. She lived in a safe-seeming world, the kind of suburban enclave where parents felt comfortable letting their children roam between friends' houses without constant supervision. That afternoon, Michele had been playing with friends nearby. She was last seen walking down her street, heading toward home. She never made it. Her disappearance wasn't the kind that crept up slowly. It was sudden, jarring. One moment, she was part of the ordinary rhythm of the block. The next, she was simply gone. Neighbors began searching yards, calling her name. Police arrived, combing through parks, wooded lots, and drainage ditches. As daylight faded, the search grew frantic. Among the neighbors who joined the hunt was a tall, thin man who seemed especially helpful. He moved quietly, scanning bushes, peering under decks. His name was Hadden Clark. He lived with his mother a few streets away and did odd jobs for residents in the area. People knew him as strange, but harmless. What no one searching that night realized was that Michele was already dead. In later accounts, Hadden would tell different versions of what happened, changing details as easily as other people changed shirts. But the core truth emerged over time. Michele had crossed paths with him that day, and for reasons that even investigators struggled to pin down, he'd lured her inside. What happened next was quick, brutal, and personal. Michele was attacked, her small body no match for the adult strength that overpowered her. The killing was not an accident, it was deliberate. The act itself, investigators would later conclude, was sexual in nature, though Hadden's fractured storytelling made it hard to separate fantasy from fact. Afterward, he treated her body with the same cold detachment he might give to an animal he'd hunted. He carried her to a wooded area and buried her shallowly, concealing her beneath leaves and debris. Then, with the kind of chilling composure that marks the most dangerous predators, he returned to the neighborhood search, blending back into the group of worried faces. For years, Michele's case went unsolved. There was no body, no physical evidence that pointed to Hadden Clark. He was questioned. Everyone in the area was, but without proof, police couldn't hold him. And so, he remained in the community, living quietly, working odd jobs, and carrying his secret like a hidden trophy. Michele's family was left with nothing but questions, and a neighborhood that no longer felt safe. For Hadden, it was something else entirely. The crossing of a line. Once he had taken a human life, he found that he could do it again. And over time, the memory of Michele's murder would become part of his private, twisted archive. One he would revisit, in thought and in action, again and again. For the families who lose a child, time changes shape. The days after a disappearance are a blur of search parties, police interviews, and sleepless nights. Then weeks pass, and with no answers, the shock dulls into a grinding ache. The case file grows thicker, but the trail grows colder. For the Montgomery County Police Department, Michele Dorr's disappearance had become just that, a cold case. In the months and years that followed, tips trickled in and were chased down, each one ending in disappointment. There was no crime scene, no recovered body, no eyewitness who could place the child in danger. And without a body, there was no proof of murder, only the gnawing suspicion that one had occurred. Meanwhile, Hadden Clark stayed in the area. He wasn't a suspect anyone could pin their hopes on. He was a man people whispered about but rarely confronted. His tall, angular frame and slightly awkward gait made him recognizable, yet he managed to fade into the background when it suited him. He rented rooms in shared houses, worked odd jobs, and kept his world small. But inside that world, his behavior was becoming harder to ignore. There were thefts, strange thefts. Women reported clothing missing from laundry rooms, lingerie disappearing from drawers. At first, these incidents seemed like minor, creepy invasions of privacy. But for those who later understood the way Hadden's mind worked, they were clues. Tokens and trophies, items stolen to fuel a private fantasy life. Neighbors noticed him watching children at play. Sometimes he would approach, trying to start conversations, offering candy or small trinkets. It was the kind of behavior that made people uneasy, but in the absence of a crime, it was easy for authorities to brush off. The years passed. Michele's family carried on as best they could. Hadden drifted from job to job, sometimes leaving abruptly after disputes with employers or coworkers. He nursed grudges against those he felt had wronged him, keeping mental lists of enemies. In the background, his fascination with violence and control deepened. He still hunted animals, sometimes killing them in ways that suggested more than sport. He collected knives and military-style gear, and he stored stolen possessions in carefully hidden caches. These were the behaviors of a man rehearsing, refining, and preparing. And then, in the mid-1990s, Hadden Clark would cross another line. This time, the victim wouldn't be a child, and the circumstances would be far harder for him to slip away from. Her name was Houghteling. She was young, educated, and came from a family not unlike the one Hadden had been born into. Her disappearance would trigger an investigation that finally began to unravel the dark double life Hadden Clark had been living for years. But before police could connect the dots between Laura and the unsolved disappearance of 6-year-old Michele, they would have to follow a trail that began in a quiet Bethesda neighborhood and wound through a web of lies, stolen identities, and the kind of meticulous, unnerving planning that had let Hadden hide in plain sight for over a decade. November 23, 1992, Bethesda, Maryland. It was a Monday morning, the kind where the air felt cold but carried the faint smell of fallen leaves, and the neighborhood was just beginning to stir. On Windsor Lane, the Houghteling house sat framed by tall trees, a picture of upper-middle-class stability. Inside, 23-year-old Houghteling was getting ready for the day. She had returned home after college, using the family house as a base while she figured out her next steps. Laura was bright, friendly, and quietly ambitious. Her life was in front of her. She wasn't alone in the house. Downstairs, in the basement apartment, lived the family's tenant. A tall, angular man with pale blue eyes and a soft-spoken manner. His name was Hadden Clark. He wasn't just a renter. He'd been recommended by friends of the family, and on paper he seemed harmless enough, a Navy veteran who picked up gardening work and handyman jobs. Laura's mother, Penny, had even trusted him with odd chores around the property. That morning, Penny left for work as usual. Laura had a job interview later in the day, and she was expected to take the bus. Somewhere between the quiet of that morning and the bustle of the afternoon commute, she vanished. When Laura didn't show up for her interview, no one panicked right away. She was an adult, after all. But by evening, Penny knew something was wrong. Laura wasn't answering calls. Her purse and identification were still in the house, and her bed looked wrong. Police arrived and began their sweep. Nothing was overturned, nothing broken, but the bed in Laura's room had been made with military precision. The comforter pulled tight, the pillows arranged just so. Penny told investigators that her daughter never made her bed that way. It was a small thing, but detectives know small things can be everything. They turned their attention to the basement apartment. Hadden Clark answered the door politely. He told them he'd seen Laura that morning, but nothing unusual. His tone was mild, his manner cooperative. He even agreed to let them look around. Inside, they found clothing that didn't seem to belong to him, women's clothing. Some of it matched descriptions of items missing from other women in the area. There were also scratches on his hands, faint but fresh. When detectives asked about them, Hadden's answer was vague. He'd been gardening. He'd nicked himself cooking. The details shifted like smoke. Within 48 hours, Hadden was on their radar as more than just a neighbor. They learned about his odd past, his history of theft, and the whispers that followed him from one rental to the next. And then they found the piece of evidence that moved suspicion into certainty. A pillowcase, taken from the Houghteling home, was recovered from a wooded area miles away. Inside it were Laura's clothes, stained with blood. DNA testing in 1992 was still in its early years, but the technology was enough to confirm what the family already feared. The blood was Laura's. There was no longer a missing person case. It was a homicide, and Hadden Clark, the quiet man in the basement, was now the prime suspect. The investigation into Laura Houghteling's murder moved quickly, not because the case was simple, but because Hadden Clark was already making mistakes. For detectives, the first 48 hours after a homicide are crucial. Every word the suspect says, every move he makes, is another chance to catch him slipping. They began with surveillance. Detectives from Montgomery County rotated shifts, watching Hadden from unmarked cars parked just far enough to be invisible to a casual glance. They logged where he went, who he spoke to, and what he carried. In the basement apartment, the walls were closing in. Hadden knew the police were interested. Their questions had been too pointed, their visits too frequent. But in his mind, he still believed he could outplay them. He told himself stories, switching between his own identity and the personas he sometimes slipped into. When he was Kristen Bluefin, the world felt different, softer, more fluid, and the details of what he'd done seemed like someone else's problem. When he was Hadden, the former Navy cook, he told himself he'd covered his tracks. The police, meanwhile, were quietly building their case. Forensics teams combed the wooded area where Laura's clothing had been found, documenting every footprint, every broken branch. The pillowcase was key. It tied the dump site directly to the Houghteling home. Detectives also re-interviewed neighbors. A few recalled seeing Hadden walking in the area on the day Laura disappeared, carrying a large plastic trash bag. Others mentioned his habit of disappearing into wooded areas for hours, sometimes returning with dirt on his clothes and scratches on his hands. They began looking into his past. It was a trail of odd jobs, abrupt departures, and disturbing rumors. Former landlords described him as strange and unsettling. A few hinted at thefts, clothing, jewelry, personal items. There were old misdemeanor charges for burglary, trespassing, and always the stories about him dressing in women's clothing. Hadden's mental world was narrowing. He had started talking to himself more, muttering under his breath in a mix of voices. To him, the police were both a threat and a challenge. Part of him wanted to run. Part of him wanted to see if he could beat them. That arrogance would prove to be his undoing. Detectives were now certain that Laura had been killed inside the house, probably in her bedroom, and that Hadden had removed her body himself. But without the body, the prosecution would have a harder time securing a conviction. They needed him to make a move to lead them closer. So they waited. They let him believe he was still in control, even as the net drew tighter. And then Hadden did something that gave them exactly what they needed. Late November, 1992. The air in Bethesda had turned sharper, the trees stripped bare. On Windsor Lane, the Houghteling house felt quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that comes after a loss the neighbors aren't ready to talk about. In the basement apartment, Hadden Clark was pacing. He'd been doing that more lately, pacing in tight little loops, pausing to check the window, then starting again. His nerves were frayed, though he'd never have admitted it. 2 streets over, an unmarked sedan idled at the curb. Inside, 2 Montgomery County detectives watched through binoculars as Hadden emerged, wearing a light jacket and carrying a plastic grocery bag. They knew that bag was important, maybe not this one, but the pattern. He carried them often, always headed toward one of the wooded strips that ran like veins through the suburban grid. "Let him go," the senior detective said. "We follow on foot. No lights, no car." Hadden's internal narrative was looping in 2 voices. Kristen told him everything was fine. He was clever, too clever for them. Hadden's own voice was darker, calculating routes, rehearsing what he'd say if they stopped him. He cut through a side yard, down a slope toward Rock Creek Park. The detectives stayed back, slipping between trees. They saw him crouch by a half-rotted log, the plastic bag crinkling softly. His hands moved quickly, practiced. When he walked away, they waited until he was out of sight, then moved in. Inside the bag, a pair of women's gloves, stained faintly with what looked like blood, and a kitchen knife with a cracked black handle. By the time Hadden returned home, a warrant was already in motion. The next morning, uniformed officers arrived with detectives in plain clothes. They knocked on the basement door. Hadden opened it slowly, blinking in the sudden flood of daylight. "We have a warrant to search the premises," one of the detectives said, handing him the folded paper. Hadden's mind was already spinning. Kristen's voice was telling him to smile, to act calm. Nicole, the evil daughter persona, was screaming to run. Hadden just stood there, motionless, as they stepped past him. The search turned up more than the detectives had hoped for. Hidden in the apartment were women's clothes in multiple sizes, some neatly folded, others balled up in bags. There was jewelry, cosmetics, and personal items, some traceable to women in the neighborhood, others a mystery. The knife from the woods was matched to a set from the Houghteling kitchen. The gloves tested positive for Laura's blood. It wasn't a full confession, and it wasn't a recovered body, but it was enough. Enough to arrest him. Enough to put him in an interrogation room where the walls were closer than any cell. As they let him out, the neighbors stood at their doors, silent. Some were surprised, others not at all. Hadden Clark, the quiet man in the basement, was no longer a tenant. He was now a murder suspect and soon a convicted killer. The room was small, painted in the kind of neutral beige that makes time feel slower. A metal table sat in the center, 2 chairs on one side, one on the other. A video camera in the corner recorded everything. Hadden Clark sat with his hands folded, eyes down. He was wearing a plain gray sweatshirt, his head shaved smooth, eyebrows gone. Across from him sat Detective Ed Tarney, flanked by Detective Michael Garvey. Both men had been on the case from the start. Tarney: "Hadden, you know why you're here." Hadden lifted his eyes, just briefly, then looked away. Hadden: "No, I don't kill people. I never killed anybody." Garvey: "We found Laura's gloves in the woods. We found your fingerprints on the bag. And we found her blood on the knife. That's not nothing, Hadden." He gave a small, almost theatrical shrug. Hadden: "Maybe Kristen knows something about that." Tarney leaned forward. Kristen, he'd heard the name before in whispers from other inmates, was one of Hadden's alternate personas. Tarney: "Okay, then let's talk to Kristen." Hadden's posture shifted, subtle but noticeable. His voice softened, his pitch lifted. Hadden, as Kristen Laura, was difficult. She was going to tell people things. "You don't understand." Garvey: "Understand what, Kristen?" Hadden, as Kristen, she thought she was better than me. She thought I was strange. I just wanted to make her quiet. Tarney didn't flinch. "Where is she now?" Kristen's eyes flickered back to Hadden's. Hadden: "I don't know. I didn't put her anywhere." Garvey slid a photograph across the table. "Laura, smiling, taken months before her death." Garvey: "She was a person, Hadden. Someone's daughter. You took her away. We need to bring her home." For a moment, something shifted in Hadden's face. Not guilt, exactly, but a kind of private amusement. Hadden: "You'll never find her. She's gone. She's part of the earth now." The room went still. Tarney and Garvey exchanged a quick glance, the kind of glance that says we've got enough. From that point forward, the interview was a cycle: denial, evasion, flickers of confession wrapped in the voices of his alter egos. By the time they walked him back to his cell, they knew they wouldn't get a clear map to Laura's body. But they didn't need it for the conviction. They had the physical evidence. And they had his words, fragmented, bizarre, but damning enough to show a jury. The courtroom in Rockville, Maryland, was packed. Reporters filled the first 2 rows, their notebooks open, eyes flicking between the defense table and the gallery. At the far end, in seats reserved for family, Penny Houghteling sat stiff-backed, her hands knotted together in her lap. Every so often, her gaze would drift to the empty chair beside her, the space where Laura should have been. At the defense table, Hadden Clark sat in a clean shirt and slacks, his head still shaved, eyes lowered. To anyone who didn't know the details, he could have passed for a shy, awkward man in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the people in that room knew better. The prosecution's case was built without the one thing juries often crave: a body. They leaned instead on the physical evidence, the pillowcase, the knife, the gloves. Forensic technicians walked the jury through each item, explaining how Laura's blood had been identified, how the fibers matched the Houghteling home, how the fingerprints tied back to Hadden. The detectives described his inconsistent statements, his shifting personas, and his evasive answers during interrogation. They told the jury about the women's clothing found in his apartment, about the history of thefts and unsettling behavior. Then came the most quietly devastating testimony. Penny herself. She told the jury about Laura's last morning, how her daughter had been in good spirits, how she had never left home without her purse or telling someone where she was going. She described the moment she walked into Laura's bedroom and saw the bed made with that unnatural military precision. "I knew right then," she said, her voice steady but low, "that something was very wrong." The defense tried to chip away at the case, focusing on Hadden's mental state. They described him as troubled, confused, a man whose grasp on reality was fractured. They hinted that his confessions in other personas shouldn't be taken literally. Without a body, they argued, the evidence was circumstantial. But the jury had heard enough. The physical trail, the incriminating statements, the stolen items, they formed a chain too strong to break. When the verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder, Penny's eyes closed for a moment. Relief wasn't quite the right word. Laura was still gone. But at least the man who had taken her would not walk free. Hadden Clark was sentenced to 30 years in prison. It was a victory for the prosecution, but for investigators, there was a gnawing sense that this was only part of the story. Because while Hadden sat in prison for Laura's murder, there was another name that kept coming up. Another case, older, colder, and hauntingly similar. 6-year-old Michele Dorr. 1986, Montgomery County Police Department. The file on 6-year-old Michele Dorr was thin. Inside, a handful of reports. Missing person notices, search grids, interviews with neighbors. One report noted a male subject who joined the search that first night. Tall, thin, awkward, living with his mother a few streets away. His name, Hadden Clark. At the time, nothing tied him to the disappearance. Search efforts had been exhaustive. Wooded areas combed, storm drains checked, lakes and creeks dragged. But without a body, the case drifted into the cold storage of unsolved files. 1999, Western Correctional Institution, Cumberland, Maryland. 13 years later, Hadden sat across from Detective Ed Tarney in a prison interview room. He was already serving time for Laura Houghteling's murder. His posture was relaxed, almost smug. "Tarney, let's talk about Michele." Hadden tilted his head slightly, a half-smile forming. "Hadden, that was a long time ago." Tarney slid a photograph across the table. Michele, smiling shyly at the camera. "Tarney, her family deserves to know. Where is she?" Hadden studied the picture for a long moment, then looked up. "Hadden, Kristen knows." The switch was subtle, his voice higher, more deliberate. "Hadden, as Kristen, she was a sweet little thing. Came by the house. I invited her in. We had tea." Tarney didn't interrupt. "Hadden, as Kristen, then. She wouldn't stop talking. I needed her to be quiet. So I made her quiet." 1986. Neighborhood interview notes. One neighbor had told police she saw Michele walking near the Clark house the day she vanished. Another remembered seeing Hadden in the woods later that afternoon. Neither account was enough to hold him at the time. 1999. Prison interview. Tarney leaned forward. "Where did you put her?" Hadden's eyes darted to the corner of the room, as if considering whether to share. Then, in his normal voice, "Hadden, I buried her. She's gone now. You'll never find her." But that wasn't entirely true. Over the next several months, Hadden began dropping hints, to Tarney, to other inmates, even to his self-proclaimed prison confidant, Jesus. He spoke about a wooded area near his mother's house, about a grave marked by a small toy, 2000 search operation, Following his clues, detectives and cadaver dogs returned to the patch of woods. After hours of digging, they uncovered small bones, later confirmed to be those of a child. Dental records matched them to Michele Dorr. Back in the prison, when told they had found her, Hadden only smiled. For investigators, it was vindication and tragedy in equal measure. Another family had answers, but the reality was brutal. Hadden had been free for years after Michele's murder, years in which they believed he had almost certainly killed others. By the time Hadden Clark was serving time for 2 murders, the FBI's behavioral analysis unit had a different question. How many more? It wasn't just speculation. In interviews, Hadden had dropped tantalizing, chilling clues, mentions of others. Hints about bodies in different states, cryptic references to souvenirs buried in places only he knew. Detectives understood the game. Hadden liked the power of dangling information. But there was also the problem of credibility. Serial killers often inflate their numbers for attention, and Hadden's shifting personas made it harder to sort fact from fiction. Still, some of what he said matched real, unsolved cases. FBI Field Office, Baltimore, 2000. A task force formed, bringing together FBI agents, Montgomery County detectives, and police from several other jurisdictions. Maps of the East Coast were pinned with colored markers, each one representing a missing woman or child whose case details overlapped with Hadden's descriptions. Lead, Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Hadden spoke of a beach girl, buried in the dunes. He could describe the weather that day, the way the sand felt under his boots. Detectives checked cold case files from Barnstable County. There were indeed women missing from that time period. A search was organized. Wearing leg irons and under heavy guard, Hadden was transported north, along with his unusual demand. He wanted to wear women's clothing for the trip. The FBI agreed, a calculated move to keep him cooperative. On Cape Cod, he led them to 2 areas, both marked by wind-bent beach grass and scattered shells. Cadaver dogs reacted strongly, but the digging was called off when news helicopters began circling overhead. The FBI wasn't about to risk live footage of an empty hole. Lead, Connecticut and Pennsylvania. Hadden claimed to have buried victims near wooded lakes in both states. In Connecticut, his description of a trail lined with old stone walls matched real terrain. In Pennsylvania, he spoke of the one with the red coat and a shallow grave under pine needles. Searches yielded animal remains, but no human remains. Lead, Maryland, souvenir site. The most credible lead came when he talked about a stash of items, jewelry, keys, pieces of clothing, hidden in plastic buckets buried in a wooded area not far from his mother's house. Acting on his directions, detectives unearthed several containers. Inside were women's watches, earrings, lipstick tubes, and driver's licenses belonging to people long missing. Some items matched unsolved disappearance cases. Others had no immediate match at all. It was a predator's archive. The task force now faced a grim reality. Even if they never tied each item to a specific victim, the sheer number suggested a body count far higher than the 2 confirmed murders. Hadden seemed to relish their uncertainty. In one interview, he smiled and said, "I'll never tell you all of them. You'd never sleep again." The interview room inside Western Correctional Institution wasn't much. Bare walls, a metal table, 2 chairs bolted to the floor. But for the FBI's behavioral analysis unit, it was a chessboard. Across from them sat Hadden Clark, their opponent. Tall, lean, with pale eyes that seemed to drift between focus and somewhere far away. He didn't move like most men in prison. He was measured, controlled, and he was enjoying this. Agents knew Hadden's psychology was a tangle. Narcissism, paranoia, dissociation. They also knew those traits could be turned against him. This wasn't about confronting him head-on. It was about getting him to want to talk. Move 1. Feed the ego. They started with flattery. "You're smarter than most of the guys we deal with," one agent said, sliding a coffee across the table. "Most killers couldn't hide bodies the way you have." Hadden didn't smile, but his shoulders loosened. He liked being seen as superior, the hunter above the rest of the pack. Move 2. The game of secrets. They told him about another killer who'd bragged to them, a man claiming more victims than Hadden. He says he's got the highest count in the Mid-Atlantic, the agent said casually. We're not sure if we believe him. Hadden's jaw tightened. He's lying. Pause. I've got more than he does. Move 3. Give him control. They slid a map across the table, markers in different colors scattered across the counties where they suspected him. Help us out, they said. Which of these are yours? He studied the map for a long time, then tapped 2 locations, not enough to solve cases, but enough to confirm their suspicions about where to look deeper. Move 4. Kristen. When he tired of being Hadden, they invited Kristen out. The shift was immediate. A softer voice, eyes lowered, a strange girlish tilt of the head. Kristen, the agent said gently, we know you were there. We know you can tell us where she is. Kristen traced a fingertip along the map. One of them, she's near water. I liked the way it looked at sunset. Every move the agents made was designed to push him forward without letting him feel cornered. They knew pressing too hard could send him retreating into silence or worse, into fantasy. Check. Eventually, he leaned back and said, if I told you all of them, you'd never be able to find them. They're part of the world now. It wasn't the checkmate they wanted. But every conversation left them with new fragments. A physical detail here, a name there, a habit only the killer could know. Slowly, they were building a mosaic, one that suggested a far deadlier career than any jury had ever heard about. For Hadden, it was a game he believed he was winning. For the agents, it was a game they couldn't afford to lose. Picture the East Coast in the 1980s and 1990s. From the rocky beaches of Cape Cod down to the marshlands of Maryland, a narrow ribbon of highway connects small towns, suburban neighborhoods, and cities in between. Now lay over that a map of Hadden Clark's life, each pin marking where he lived, worked, or passed through. Bethesda, Maryland. Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Spots in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Virginia. He was never in one place for too long, always drifting, always working jobs that kept him mobile. Gardening, odd repairs, cooking. 1974 to 1980. Early drift. Hadden's post-Navy years saw him moving between rentals and temporary work. No confirmed murders from this period, but 2 missing persons cases from coastal Massachusetts would later catch the FBI's attention. Both young women, both vanishing near the tourist beaches where Hadden liked to walk alone at night. 1981 to 1986. Montgomery County, Maryland. This is where 6-year-old Michele Dorr vanished. Hadden was living with his mother at the time, just a short walk from Michele's home. Police later confirmed he joined the search party the night she went missing. Late 1980s. Connecticut and Pennsylvania leads. During sporadic work stints in Connecticut and rural Pennsylvania, 2 other disappearances occurred. A woman last seen jogging along a lakeside trail, and another whose red coat was found in the woods. Her body never recovered. Hadden later made cryptic remarks about both. Matching details never released publicly. Early 1990s. Bethesda, Maryland. Hadden was renting the basement of the Houghteling home when Laura disappeared in 1992. Her body was never recovered, but the forensic evidence tied him directly to her murder. Mid-1990s. Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Hadden returned to Cape Cod, picking up seasonal work. Around this time, 2 local cold cases matched his descriptions during FBI interviews, one involving a woman last seen leaving a bar near the docks, another whose remains were rumored to be buried in the dunes. The pattern, the pins on the map reveal a chilling truth. Wherever Hadden stayed more than a few months, there are unsolved disappearances. Mostly women, occasionally children. The victims are vulnerable in different ways. Some living alone, some trusting him enough to let him inside their homes, some simply crossing his path at the wrong moment. There's a scatterplot of opportunity and predation. And between those pins are the hidden souvenir sites, wooded patches or sandy inlets where he buried not just bodies, but tokens of his crimes. The FBI's map is still unfinished. Every time they think they've marked his full range, another lead comes in, a new missing person, a fresh connection. For the agents, the terrifying possibility remains. Hadden Clark's true body count might never be known. Neighbor, Bethesda, Maryland. He was quiet, kept to himself. Tall, thin, almost shy. But there was just something off. I catch him watching the kids play from across the street. Never said much, just stared. We told ourselves he was harmless. I wish we hadn't. Former landlord, Massachusetts. He paid cash, always on time, but he had strange habits. Would come and go at odd hours. I went into the basement once when he was out, just to check the water heater, and I saw bags of women's clothes. Not laundry, not like they belonged to a girlfriend. Just piles. I didn't ask questions. Should've. Coworker, landscaping job, Maryland. Hadden could work hard when he wanted, but he had this temper. One day we were trimming hedges for a customer, and she made some comment about the shape. Next thing I know, he's gripping the shears so tight his knuckles are white, just staring at her. Didn't say a word, but I swear, I thought he was going to lunge at her. Neighbor, Montgomery County, Maryland, near the Dorr family. The night Michele went missing, he was right there with the rest of us, searching, flashlight in hand, quiet as a shadow. I remember thinking it was good of him to help, but later when I heard, it made me sick. He'd been looking for her with us, and he already knew where she was. Fellow tenant, shared house, Connecticut. He'd cook in the middle of the night. Meat mostly, but it was never fresh. Smelled like it was going bad, and he'd eat it like nothing was wrong. One time I woke up and found him sitting at the kitchen table, just staring at me, not saying a word. I moved out the next week. Former employer, restaurant kitchen. He was skilled with a knife, no doubt about it. Could bone a fish or break down a roast in minutes. But sometimes he'd just keep sharpening the blade long after it was already razor sharp, looking down at it with this faraway expression. Made everyone uneasy. Montgomery County detective. In the moment, you collect all these little oddities. The clothes, the looks, the late-night walks. But they're not crimes by themselves. Looking back now, they were the outline of the man we were hunting. By the early 2000s, Hadden Clark had settled into the rhythms of prison life. But settled never meant ordinary. His cell was sparse, but arranged with a strange precision. Sheets pulled tight enough to bounce a coin, shoes aligned toe to wall, every possession placed at exact right angles. On the wall above his bed, he'd taped a single page torn from a fashion magazine. A model in an evening gown, staring back with a half smile. Mornings began with a ritual. He'd wake before lights on, sitting cross-legged on the bunk, sharpening a plastic comb against the concrete floor until it was fine enough to scratch deep lines into his skin. Sometimes he used it on himself. Sometimes he'd offer it to other inmates, a gift no one wanted. The prison staff quickly learned he had multiple modes. In one, he was polite, quiet, even helpful. In another, he slipped into his Kristen persona, softening his voice, folding his hands in his lap, asking for makeup he knew he'd never be allowed. And then there were the darker moods, when his eyes went cold and distant, and he muttered to himself about finishing the job. Other inmates kept their distance, not out of fear of violence, though there was that, but because Hadden had a way of getting inside your head. He'd drop hints about murders he hadn't been convicted of, describing details too specific to be random. Then, without warning, he'd laugh and say, "Or maybe I'm just making it up." He wrote letters to reporters, to true crime authors, to strangers whose addresses he found in old newspapers. Each letter was bait. Cryptic drawings of wooded areas, references to sleeping beauties, and lists of first names that could have been victims or figments of his imagination. In the prison yard, he walked in slow, deliberate laps, eyes scanning the ground as if looking for something only he could see. When asked, he'd say, "I'm remembering where I left things." Even behind walls, with every hour accounted for, Hadden Clark found ways to play his game, keeping himself at the center of a mystery only he truly understood, and only he could choose to solve. By 2010, Hadden Clark was no longer the tall, lean figure who had once prowled quiet neighborhoods. Prison had worn him down. His head was still shaved, but his skin was thinner, his movements slower. Diabetes and other health problems had started to claim pieces of him. For investigators, this was both an opportunity and a threat. Opportunity because failing health sometimes loosens tongues. Threat because if Hadden died without talking, the secrets would die with him. The cold case task force dusted off files, revisiting the maps, the souvenir lists, the taped interviews. They knew his patterns. The way he liked to control the pace, the thrill he got from watching them chase clues. If they wanted more, they'd have to make him feel like he still held the winning hand. Western Correctional Institution interview room. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. An FBI agent laid out a folder of photographs. Missing women, girls, even a few men whose disappearances overlapped with Hadden's known movements. Agent, some of these we know. Some we think you might know. Hadden studied the photos with the slow deliberation of a man savoring a meal. He tapped one. A young woman in a blue windbreaker and murmured, "She liked to run. I stopped her once, asked for the time. She shouldn't have stopped." It was the kind of fragment they'd come to expect. Just enough detail to be believable, not enough to close the case. Field Operation, Rural Maryland. Weeks later, Hadden was shackled and loaded into a van, bound for a wooded area he described in one of his letters. The air was cold, the ground wet from recent rain. He shuffled through the leaves, stopping occasionally to point at the ground. "There," he said once, then changed his mind. "No, it was over here. The trees are wrong now." The search team dug in both spots. Nothing, just roots and damp earth. But one of the cadaver dogs hit faintly on a third location, a patch of disturbed soil. Inside, they found a rusted tin box containing a woman's bracelet and a single high-heeled shoe. No body, no definitive ID. The clock running down. Back in prison, Hadden's health continued to slide. He lost weight. His hands shook. Yet when asked about the items in the tin box, he smiled faintly and said, "Some things I'll keep to myself." The frustration was palpable. Investigators knew there were more victims. They could feel them in the gaps, in the half-truths he fed them. But they also knew the game was ending, and Hadden had no intention of letting them win outright. By the end of that year, their window was nearly closed. By the mid-2010s, Hadden Clark was a shadow of the man who had once taunted detectives across the interview table. His walk was slower now, shuffled and uneven. His once precise posture had slumped. Infirmary visits became routine, kidney issues, circulatory problems, complications from diabetes. The predator was fading, but the mind games weren't. From his prison bed, he still wrote letters, shaky handwriting replacing the crisp block letters of earlier years. The content hadn't changed. Hints, names without surnames, drawings of landscapes that could be anywhere. One letter to a retired detective read, "Some things are better left in the ground. I'll see them again when you do." For the families of suspected victims, each cryptic sentence was a knife twist. Some still hoped for answers. Others came to accept they'd never get them. 2018 infirmary interview. A cold case investigator sat at Hadden's bedside. "You're running out of time," the detective said plainly. Hadden's lips curled into a faint smile. "So are you." He spoke slowly, voice thin, telling a story about a woman who had the prettiest hair, who'd been quiet as the leaves when I was done. The details matched no known case, or perhaps one they hadn't connected yet. And then, mid-sentence, he closed his eyes and drifted off. The final days. By early 2020, his condition worsened. The man who once roamed woods with a knife and a garbage bag now couldn't walk the length of his cell without stopping to rest. Prison nurses said he sometimes mumbled in his sleep. Names, fragments of locations, the occasional laugh. On a gray morning in May, Hadden Clark died in the infirmary of Western Correctional Institution. No final confession. No neat, packaged list of victims. Just silence. Aftermath. For detectives, his death was a blow. Not because they mourned him, but because the living link to so many unanswered cases was gone. Cold case boards remained dotted with his name, pinned beside photos of victims whose files would now never be closed. For the families, it was complicated. Some felt a grim sense of relief. Others felt robbed, denied the truth by a man who chose control over compassion until his last breath. The official record says Hadden Clark was convicted of 2 murders. The unofficial record, the one detectives and FBI agents keep in the quiet corners of their minds, suggests the number could be 5, 10, maybe more. And somewhere, scattered across the wooded edges of the East Coast, the ground still keeps its secrets. When a case like Hadden Clark's closes, at least on paper, it doesn't truly end. The evidence is boxed, the files archived, but the ripples keep moving outward, through families, through neighborhoods, through the men and women who hunted him for decades. In Montgomery County, veteran detectives still talk about him, not out of morbid fascination, but because his case became a warning. Predators like Clark can live in plain sight for years, even decades, blending just enough into the background to seem unremarkable until it's far too late. Lesson 1: The nomadic predator. Hadden's mobility was both his camouflage and his weapon. Drifting between states, taking temporary jobs, and living in transient housing made it harder for patterns to emerge. Each jurisdiction saw only a fragment of the bigger picture. It took the FBI's interstate coordination to start connecting the dots. Lesson 2: The trophy keeper. The buckets of buried items, jewelry, keys, bits of clothing weren't just souvenirs. They were psychological anchors, a way for Hadden to revisit his crimes in private. In investigative circles, these trophy sites are now considered critical evidence, often leading to victims even decades later. Lesson 3: The manipulator's game. Hadden thrived on control. He learned early how to use his personas, like Kristen, to stall, confuse, or bait investigators. Understanding his need for attention became the key to drawing out fragments of truth. But the danger is always that such killers mix truth with lies until even they blur the lines. Lesson 4: Community blind spots. In every neighborhood he lived, people noticed something. The odd hours, the unsettling stares, the hoarded clothes. But without a crime in front of them, most ignored the instinct that something was wrong. His case became a reminder: trust your gut, even when the facts aren't yet clear. Lesson 5: The cold case clock. The race against Hadden's declining health was a harsh lesson in timing. Investigators now treat aging suspects as high-priority leads, knowing that once they're gone, so is any chance at confession. For law enforcement, the Clark case lives on as a textbook example in profiling nomadic predators. How to track them, how to pressure them, and how to read the psychological currents beneath their words. For the families, though, it's not about lessons. It's about empty chairs at kitchen tables, birthdays never celebrated, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, the earth still covers what they've lost. It begins on a quiet street, a maple-lined road in a Maryland suburb, where the sound of children's bicycles clicking against the pavement blends with the hum of lawnmowers. It's the kind of place where people nod to one another over hedges, where doors are left unlocked on summer afternoons. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a man walked among them. Tall, soft-spoken, unnoticed by most. He mowed lawns, fixed fences, carried groceries for neighbors. He was also, quietly, mapping his own dark geography. From Bethesda to Cape Cod, from Pennsylvania lakesides to the woods behind his mother's house. Hadden Clark turned ordinary landscapes into graveyards. Each site chosen with the care of a gardener planting seeds. Each souvenir buried as if marking a future harvest only he would ever reap. In court, they proved 2 murders. In the minds of those who chased him, they suspect far more. 5? 10? More than a dozen? The number is a shadow, shifting, unreachable, always just beyond the light. Families of the missing still drive those roads. They still glance at the tree lines and wonder if their answers lie just a few feet beyond the asphalt. Investigators still keep his name pinned to boards in back offices, next to grainy photos of faces long gone. When Hadden Clark died in 2020, the headlines were short. Convicted killer dies in prison. But the real story didn't end there. It lives in the unsolved files, the half-matched evidence, the letters that sit in storage boxes, each one containing a hint, a fragment, a breadcrumb he tossed out knowing it would never be enough. The question lingers like fog. How many? Somewhere, in the quiet places where the earth swells just slightly over what lies beneath, the answer waits. And maybe, just maybe, the ground will tell it one day.